St. Bernard History Lecture Series. We want to say a special thanks to Bill and Chris Haynes in the back, part of the Merrill Foundation. When we began this venture, we were not sure if we were going to have the funding to continue it. We weren't sure if Nunez Community College was going to be able to fund it because of those restraints. But because of the generosity of the Merrill Foundation and the use of this wonderful building, we have the grant to continue forward for a little while with this series to get St. Bernard history pretty much on the books. And we're very, very grateful for that. I'm going to introduce you to the gentleman who instigated all of this good stuff, Dr. Curtis Manning. He has been the father of not only the Nunez History Lecture Series, but now the St. Bernard History Lecture Series. Dr. Manning.
Thank you very much, Michelle. So I'd like to welcome you to the second installment of the St. Bernard History Lecture Series. We will be going chronologically in snippets until we get to the present day with St. Bernard. So today's lecture will be from prehistory up to about 1718. The Native Americans, the formation of the land, those kind of things. And so it should be an excellent one next month. And if you're on the mailing list, you'll get plenty of information. It'll be from 1719 to about 1783 or so. So the time after the Europeans came to New Orleans, before the Isleños came here, but we're getting ready to come here. And then we'll keep going with that. So it should be very good. All the videos will be on the website. And so if you missed one, you'll be able to see that as well. We also have started a St. Bernard Historical Community Meeting, which is on the second Monday of the month, of just a very informal, collaborative process of just people who like St. Bernard history getting together and talking. And we had no idea what would happen with either this lecture series or that, but I felt a little bit good, even with this lecture, because tonight's speaker will be Ron Chapman, who many of you know very well, has been the most prolific lecturer in St. Bernard and the Nunez History Lecture Series and a bunch of other things, and fantastic. But also we will have two additional guests who were discovered almost randomly at one of our previous meetings. And so just a great serendipity. We have been trying for 16 years with the Nunez History Lecture Series to do a lecture on Native Americans in St. Bernard. That has always been the #1 most requested topic, and we just could never find anybody that was knowledgeable, that really wanted to do it. And so just by chance, we got this lecture that included that to try to get it going, and we found two experts that came along with it. So in addition to Ron, right afterwards, we'll have Dr. Marco Giardino, and we also we'll have Greg Gagliano, who will have a lot of artifacts to tell us about, and then you'll get to see as well. So I'd like to introduce the lecturer for tonight, Ron Chapman.
Okay, so we're going to begin this here on the early land mass. I'm so glad to have Greg here and with the doctor. Again, pleasure. Because I can't say I know very much about the Native American experience here in St. Bernard. I kind of covered Louisiana a bit in my regular classes, so I'm thrilled to hear what you have to say. So I'll kind of defer to the two of you all more when we get to that particular topic. Right now, we're just talking about the land mass, and this is the ice ages. If you look at it, climate change is something that's constant. It's no surprise it didn't just suddenly happen. And what I want you to look at is this area right here in particular. Because what you have with Native Americans, the current theory is, and it seems to be pretty well documented, some of their variations to the theme along the coast and along those lines. But the basic theory is that Native Americans came here across the land bridge, sea level has increased. As the ice of the ice age accumulated, some say it's up to about a mile thick when it gets around this area here, the water levels dropped substantially and land was exposed, and these basically nomadic peoples crossed this land bridge. We call it land bridge, it's very wide, following the herds. And then as the ice started accumulating, and then you see it fluctuates a lot. It also creates the Great Lakes and a lot of other lakes all throughout this entire area. And then as it finally, this is the furthest extent of it, about 12,000 years ago, then as it starts retreating, you see the water turning, and it gets cut off. So the Native Americans were basically marooned on two continents. That's how they got here. And there's some genetics on this as to, thank you, Chris. So basically, once they got here, they started working their way down along the coastline and along the rest of the landmass. And started populating the general areas. Also, with the ice ages, as the ice accumulated and it started melting finally, it changed the course of the Mississippi River to what the current Mississippi River is today. And with all that flood of water coming out, it carried a lot of debris that was part of that glacier with it. And get to the PowerPoint. You have this embayment, which is an area that came in with water, low-lying area. And as the ice age melted, and you can see here, this is just about the Ohio River, Missouri's up this way here, the water came flushing down, it changed the directions. The ice sheet that came in this direction, it forced the Mississippi River into its current bounds along the top here. And you can see these lines as the different periods of time, as basically this embayment filled its way in, okay? So as that starts happening, that's what's starting to create Louisiana. Louisiana's coastline is only about 7,500 years old. So you can see here, this is about how the rivers were before, and then the ice age sets in and changes the entire topography of the United States. And this is the Mississippi River. And as you see, as it's extending down, it's dropping the silt. This is 3,000, 2,200 years ago. This is Coconut Delta, 1,700 years ago. So you start because the Lake Pontchartrain's open. Then it swings back down again. 1,700 to 1,250 years ago. It's kind of like if you washed your car, turn the hose on with the nozzle.
Yeah.
That's exactly what it's doing. That's a free-flowing wild river. So you got the Lafourche Delta. It's the St. Bernard Delta. So you see it's closed off. So 1,375 to 750 years ago. So you didn't even have land here for Native Americans to be on until relatively shortly. So you're not going to go back and find things that are thousands of years old. Am I correct on that, sir? It just wasn't there. There was no there. Okay? So now you see the continuation, how the deltas have developed. Thank you, Chris. You can get back to that. So you see how Louisiana was developed over time. And what it was, like I said, it's like this hose just spinning back and forth like that, spewing out fresh water and sediment. And that's what constantly built the coastline. 1718, we found the walls, we started building levees. From that point on, we've levied the river in. It's no longer running free. So as a result, and also it's no longer overflowing its boundaries, which is replenishing the marshes with fresh water. So as a result, you have a combination of factors coming in, which are now resulting in erosion. So here you have the different deltas laid out, showing how they are in the ages. This is another view of the same thing. So you can see this is the big one. This is the one that basically builds the area of St. Bernard Parish. So we're only looking at this range about 1,000 years ago. This is an interesting series of graphics. This is just a little bit of context there, and it's showing the land erosion. So this is what they estimate the land mass here looked like in 1839, 1870, 1993. You can see how much is lost. And that's part of the problem too, because areas, if you go back where they had land and there may have been structures that Native Americans had brought into the area, they're disappearing rapidly. So it'll be possibly underwater. So it'll be very difficult to find where they were. This is what it looks like today. This is Mr. Go. This is, the whole marsh area, 80,000 acres of cypress swamp were wiped out of the combination of Mr. Go and the saltwater intrusion that resulted from building that canal. But you can see here's St. Bernard Parish here, and as this erodes, the ability to find artifacts is disappearing. So we're running a race there. Louisiana natives, I'll be very brief on this because I have some knowledgeable minds in here that will help me out with this. This is basically, as I was explaining before, this is the Ice Age. It came out of Africa, humans, about 100,000 years ago, the last wave. 40,000 years here, 25,000 years here. They estimate about 15,000 years ago, and they crossed over this area here. That number is questionable. Different people have different views on that, but more or less, you don't dig here like you find in Africa and find early bones. As far back as you go is around 14,000 for that gather, and it's up here around Alaska. They found a camp, so to speak, and residual, should we say, the evidence that they based it on. Then you see there's about 12,000 years ago, they get into the central part of this area down here. Okay, so we only have a relatively brief history even then, but even then, Louisiana as such didn't exist. This is another view of the same migrations. The Native Americans were Neolithic culture, if you look at it. So you talk about Stone Age people, they basically were. They lacked, for the most part, a written language. They did not use the wheel. They used travois, which was basically the poles that they laid their skins across and dragged things. They didn't have a horse until the Spanish left them, here when the Spanish arrived. They had no metal tools. That's a bit of an extension because they had some metal in the sense that they had some copper and some gold, but they never really had bronze. They never entered the Bronze Age. They didn't take tin and copper and melt it together about 1800 degrees and create bronze tools. So they didn't have that. They made the garments from animal skins, vegetation, things of that sort. They lacked domestic animals except for the dog. That's important because what will wipe out the Native Americans for the most part is European diseases, in particular smallpox. He estimate that 80% of Native Americans died because of smallpox and similar diseases, and that's because as we domesticated animals through zoonosis, the diseases that inhabit those particular animals jump across species to us. Since they didn't domesticate any animals, they basically had no immunities whatsoever to these sorts of things. So when Europeans came in, they were exposed to disease for the first time, and it just basically wiped out their populations. They used spears, bows, arrows, and hunting for protection. So obviously they didn't have firearms or anything along those lines. So it's a primitive culture as far as some elements of technology, but not intellectually by any means. If you study the Native American culture, they're an incredibly rich culture. And there's a problem some people make by looking at what things people have and judging the society based upon possessions, and sometimes not taking into account much more serious things. Like I had a friend of mine in town, Robert Paduch. He had nothing, but he had everything. He lived on the end of a coral reef in a hut with a cayuca underneath it. Robert did what he wanted every day of his life. He was 60 years old. He was the happiest man you ever met in your life. I'm thinking, I'm here on vacation for 2 weeks, and he lives this way every day of his life. Who's really ahead of the game here? So you have to be very careful about making judgments about cultures, especially Native American cultures. The first culture we have here in Louisiana is Poverty Point, which goes back about 1500 to 500 BC. It's an incredibly rich culture with tremendous mountains. You can still go there, actually. It's the extreme northeastern part of Louisiana. It began around the Gulf Coast, spread inland. Most of the time it's clay objects they have, because if you look at the extension, as you see the Mississippi River, we don't have rocks. There's three types of rocks. There's igneous, sedimentary, and metamorphic. We got sedimentary at best. So you don't really have any rocks per se to make arrowheads, things like that. You have to trade for those things. So the things they would make would be out of clays along those lines, other than the things they traded for, the items they traded for. Then you also have the Garcia sites located on the eastern edge of Lake Pontchartrain. The Trefuncta culture is in St. Tammany Parish. There's 2 shell villages there. There's marshes in the northeast of New Orleans. Coastal tribes usually settled along these natural ridges. So you saw it as the Mississippi was swinging back and forth. It's creating natural levees. So as time would set in, that mud would settle down, things would start growing there, it would become firmer, much more stable. As a result, the people could start moving there and start existing and fishing and hunting, whatever have you. It takes a period of time for that to take place, and they're going to go, obviously, to the high ground. That's why we first settled New Orleans. We settled in the highest ground. So the same thing happens here. You have the coastal tribes living along these ridges. Think about it, at this point, it's still too recent, to actually habitate a lot of people. If I'm mistaken there or not, but I believe that's the case. Well, usually small tribes, about maybe 50 in a group. As the cultures develop, the populations, you're looking at a clan culture more than anything else, expanding more into tribes later on, to much larger populations. You have the Troyville Cold Creek culture, around here, 400 to 1100 AD. They start now spreading into coastal Louisiana and Mississippi. And then finally around here, we have southeast culture houses around the center mountain, larger populations, and they're cultivating beans, squash, maize, and he participated in hunting and fishing and a variety of other skills that have developed. We've also developed pottery at this time. So imagine this is what you'd be finding with some of the pottery that you'd see out there. You know, it's different from the way we make pottery today, because now when you fire something, you fire it probably around between 1,800 and 2,000 degrees. They were building regular fires to fire the pottery, and so it wouldn't be as strong as the stuff we had. I know at Nunez one time we had Bert Cisneros from running in from Santa Clara Mesa in New Mexico. He was a master of black pottery, and he just fired it right there on the campus in the front yard. He did it within about an hour and a half, 2 hours. It's beautiful work, but the deal is, if you try to take true pottery in a kiln, you're talking about almost 24 hours to get it fully fused into the glass that it's supposed to be. So you don't get this high temperature, so it's a much more delicate type of thing. You couldn't put it in a fire cooking. It would probably crack, okay? The 6 beige Indian groups in Louisiana would be the Alpaca in the extreme southwest. They were the most primitive, nomadic, and as I understand, cannibalistic. Not totally so, but enough so that some French settlers that were traders that were working with them, as I appreciate the story, I forget what the source was, it might have been Duprat's, but it might have been before him, talking about how his Frenchmen met with them and were having dinner, and then they looked at a bowl and realized what they were eating, and which caused them a problem being Catholic, eating another human, but at the same time, you don't make an issue out of it because you might offend somebody and end up in the next pot. So as a result, you know, so we know that much about them. But they also at this time, they're nomadic, but you're starting to get the introduction of horses fairly soon, because once they get in by the Spanish around 1519, they start spreading wild. If you read LaSalle's accounts of people who survived LaSalle's experience, you'll see that as they're working their way towards the Mississippi, they're running into these tribes. And it's really fascinating when you read it, where they're just now starting to understand, as they cross through Louisiana, how to deal with a horse. You know, it's new to them, so they're still trying to figure out. Later on, you'll find that they're almost married to the horse. You know, the culture has developed on it. The Caddo, first nomadic tribe to use horses, associated Texas and the Oklahoma tribes. These are the ones I was just referencing that LaSalle's compatriots ran into. You have the Tunica in the northeast of the state, much more advanced than the Caddo. The Natchez, mid-state. This is a particularly tragic experience in my view, because they were so very helpful to the French. The French moved here, and within 48 years they were gone. Because of incidents of 2 particular Frenchmen in 2 wars, I can recall them, that broke out. You know, within 48 years, those who weren't killed in the war were brought to New Orleans, put on ships, and sold into slavery to Haiti. So that was the end of the Natchez tribe, which was an incredibly rich culture. If you go up to Natchez, they still have the Grand Village there. It's peculiar because it's the middle of a subdivision almost. It's just kind of strange. You know, drive down the street and suddenly end up there. And then the Muskegon, which is mostly the areas that we're talking about, which is southeast Mississippi, the great fishermen, the shell Indians, this sort of things. Okay. Chitimacha, more water culture in the western areas. This would be a small Indian village. As you look at it, what's going on here. You know, you have the huts. A lot of times these huts would be simply made by taking saplings and pulling them together and tying the ends and then covering them. We see that at the summer festivals with the palmetto huts. You know, it works. Very, very simple. Here you have the dugout canoes. They use the fire method for both cutting it and for digging it out. You have some skins stretched out on the ground here. So it's very simple but pleasant life, to say the least. This is one of the earlier maps of Louisiana. This is what Indian dress would look like, as the cross put it, basically on a male's covered with that which should be covered, you know, which is nothing but a loincloth. Just simply rope around the waist and a loincloth. Children, for the most part, nude, women wore blouses. In the winter, obviously, they dress more. This is the grand house of the Natchez. It's made out of mud. See how tall it is? It's extravagant. No windows. And the interesting thing, when I was in it, because they still have one there was no hole in the top. I said, that's odd, because they have a fire in the inside. And I got to thinking, it makes all the sense in the world, because it's so tall, the smoke would go up to the top. It would smoke out any rodents or anything in it and keep the thatch dry. So it's really genius. The interesting thing here is, if you notice this thing over here, that's basically a food supply. What they've done is they build a similar thing to the house that they have, and they put it on a piece of timber that's stripped of bark and carefully sanded and covered with bear grease. It's to keep rats out. and roads from getting into your food. Kind of the same thing we do with Mardi Gras, greasing poles. That's in essence what they're doing to protect the food source. Now I'll talk about the Europeans around. Before I get there, I remember once, before Katrina, when I was teaching my Louisiana class, Brandy, I forget her grandfather's last name just now, it escapes me. He had the skull. Treadaway, Brandy Treadaway came into class, and I got a call from the library. She said, "I'm going to bring something for class." I said, "Oh, great, you know." So I got a call from the library. I said, "Well, we have a problem." I said, "What kind of problem you got?" She says, "Well, somebody brought something." I said, "Oh, yeah, she brought the artifact." She says, "Ron, it's a human skull." I said, "Oh, great." She goes, "No, not great. We can't have a human skull in the library." I said, "I'll come get it." It was amazing. It was a beautiful skull. It was perfect. It had dated on it 800 AD. Was it? I think so. He found it in some dig around there, and he brought it to school, and the teeth were absolutely perfect, beautiful, other than the fact that they were totally flat. So I don't know whether they were shaved, or that's a question of when they make grain and they use the mano and mate, they're eating grain and rock at the same time. Maybe they sand their teeth down. But it was an amazing artifact. But 800 AD goes to show that Native Americans were living in St. Bernard at 800 AD. What culture it was, how highly developed it was, how many they were, I don't know. Perhaps this gentleman here could be a tremendous help, and I'm very anxious to learn, because I do know it's a narrow window between the period of time in the earlier slides you see when the landmass developed and as the landmass erodes. So you got this relatively small window for these people to operate in. Now, looking at the European arrival, Columbus discovered America. I love that one. In 1492, the Spanish were the ones who basically took the heels on it. Of course, you know about the conquistadors going into Mexico, Cortez and Pizarro, heading down to the Inca and taking all this gold. What ended up happening was most of these Spaniards believed there was gold everywhere. So as a result, they went looking everywhere. It didn't take them long to cast their eyes up to the northern coast of the Gulf of Mexico to see what they could find. So the Spanish are the first ones to show up. The first one you have is Pinada, the native. He comes along the coast here, he stops, he confronts some Indians, and as his records say, they had a bit of a conflict. Some of his men were killed, eaten, and their skins were thrown over the sides of the little fort that the Indians built, so he decided, that's good enough for me. So he sails off along the coast, but what he does is he draws basically the first map of the coastline. He mentions a river, he puts in the River of Palms. We don't know what river that is. Likely it's the Mississippi because of the size of it, but we really don't know. It could have been the Mobile, but I'd bet on the Mississippi River. You then have a bit of a break until you have Narvaez arrive. He's an interesting character. He shows up here. He takes his troops and splits them. Half stay with the ships, the other half go inland with him. He tells the guys on the ships to wait till they come back out. They wait a year, and he never comes back out. And what he does is he works his way to the interior. He's constantly having struggles with the Indians. He's talking about that's another interesting thing. They talk about the vast numbers of Indians they're running across, and the struggles that they're having. The problem is we'll see the difference between the French and the Spanish, because when the French show up, there's just a few people in a canoe. When the Spanish show up, they're showing up with hundreds of guys, horses, war dogs, everything you can imagine. Somebody knocks on your house and says, hello, there's two people, you invite them in to eat. 300 show up, you've got a totally different reaction to the situation. So he has nothing but conflicts along the way until finally he's driven out. He goes off, they end up taking boats. We think it could have been the Mississippi River. They're chased as they go out. He takes a storm of his crew as his exploration group separates into different parties. He's never heard from again. Nobody knows what happens to him. But one of his guys, the Vaca, is captured. He spends quite a few years in captivity. He finally escapes with several of his friends, works his way to Mexico City. I think he's gone somewhere in the neighborhood of about 12 years. Along the line. So these people spend a lot of time. You think that would be enough, but the next one would be Cortez. I'm sorry, De Soto. De Soto would be the last one to come in. He's still convinced that there's a lot of riches up here, so he's going to travel from 1539 to 42. For 3 years, he spans all the way throughout the entire Southeast. What we get from the Spanish, the first impressions with the Native Americans, that lived in this area. So you can only assume that the cultures that were growing up here in St. Bernard Parish must have been very similar to the cultures that you had in this particular area or along here. De Soto, as you know, dies. After he dies, his lieutenant Moscoso takes over. He likewise builds boats, works his way down the Mississippi River, and works his way back to Mexico City. But while he's there, if you read his records, you'll see that he experiences the spring flood, where they wake up one day and the Mississippi River is completely flooded over its course and it's rising like it always did. They have to climb into trees and wait for the water to come down enough so they can get back to building their boats and escape and come back. At this point, the Spanish are completely convinced that there's nothing of any value here. Basically, tunnels and gatherers. It's not Mexico. It's not the Aztec. It's not the Maya. It's not the Inca. It's not full of golden temples and coke and large cities and all that. It's subsistence living. So you have a break, 129 years break. So you always, at least in my mind, I wonder, what was it like for the Native Americans? Because they don't have a written language. They don't have a history that we can read. What was it like after having these Spanish show up in these vast numbers, diseases breaking out tremendously, the carnage that took place, and almost as quickly as they came, they're gone. And then nothing. It's like the storm that passed through for a number of years there. Until finally the French arrived, 129 years later. There's your Frenchman. Of course, they weren't dressed that way. They were Voltaires and Courrier de Bois, but nevertheless, it gets the point across. The first one is the Marquette and Joliet. What happens is you have the Iroquois Confederacy in this area that controls everything. The French are finally able to break that Confederacy down through negotiations where they can now move into the Ohio Valley. And they start hearing about this large river to the west. So they decide to find out what it is. So Joliet, who's a fur trader, more a fur factory wife, and Marquette take several canoes and they come down this way, enter the Mississippi River, and come down the Mississippi River. They hope it's going to go west, but they keep trying to get to China. It's just not going to happen. But they start realizing that it's not going west, it's going south. But you have to look at what their business is. Their business is fur trading. And they bring their furs to Montreal, for shipment. That means when you're going further and further west, you have to canoe from Montreal all the way to where your ports are west, around Portage and Lake Superior, Mackinac, all these different places. You can't get there directly by water, which means what you do is you load your canoe up, you paddle as far as you can, and it's called a portage. You take everything out, you carry the canoe till you get the water again, drop it in, and you keep working your way, which is strenuous work. Figure each canoe would have packs about 90 pounds in it. Each one of the voyageurs would put 90 pounds on their back, put another 90 pounds on top of it, and then carry it to the next area of water, drop everything, go back, get another load, come back, drop it, go back, get the canoe, come back, load it up, and keep doing that. So you can imagine, the farther west you got, the harder it got. That's what Joliet's looking at. When he takes this Mississippi River, he discovers, A, there's no waterfalls, and there's no hindrances, and no portages. His mind is automatically starting to ring. Yeah, it may be going south, but where does it go? It could go to the Gulf, which means we can load up all those Western goods and come right down this river, unhindered. He gets about to here when he meets some of the local tribes, and they suggest he not go any further because he wouldn't be welcomed and liably killed. At which point he says, well, I figured I got the information I needed, I think I'll head back up. So he goes back up and reports what he's found. It's not a few years later that you get LaSalle, 10 years later. He's another one who's a factor. What he's trying to do is go back and trace the direction. He comes down the Ohio River and see where it really ends. That's his goal. And he takes his canoes and his men and he comes down the river, stays inside the river the whole time, and he gets to the head of the passes. They split three guys. Tonti is one, and himself. They all find the Gulf of Mexico. They meet at the head of the passes, and it's at that point that he plants the flag of France and declares Louisiana all waters drained by the Mississippi River, which basically claims everything from the Appalachian Mountains to the Rocky Mountains belonging to the King of France, without any regard to the people who've been living there for 14,000 years. A little bit of arrogance, to say the least, but nevertheless, that's what he does. He then decides that he wants to build a base here. He goes back to France. He gets permission to build a fort at the mouth of the river. Through bad navigation, he passes up the mouth of the river, ends up along the coast of Texas. He builds an encampment there, a fort called Fort St. Louis. from Fort St. Louis. He stays there several years. He keeps going west, trying to find the Mississippi River, until finally this guy starts running, like, maybe he ought to go east. So he's heading east across this way. That's when he ran across the local Indian tribes. And apparently he had an issue with arrogance. It came up kind of earlier when he was sailing across as well. And his people killed him. You know, so then after they kill him, they have two parties. You know, one party kills him, the other group didn't want to, but they're stuck in the middle of nowhere, so they got to depend on one another. So they work their way close to the Mississippi River, where they find Fort St. Louis that Tonti had set up for fur trading. The guys that killed LaSalle realized that it probably wouldn't be a good idea to be back in French hands again, so we don't know what happens to them. They just decide not to cross the river. They go drifted back in Indian territory, I guess. The rest of them go back up. Tonti had been looking for LaSalle. He had come down to the mouth of the river, explored, couldn't find him. He leaves a note in a hollow tree, and he leaves another note with the Quinnipiac Indians saying, you know, if you see somebody like me, give them this note. He then goes back up and continues his fur trading. But he was very, very close to LaSalle, and he desperately lost it. Then we got these two. Ta-da! You know, the two brothers. What happens now, France decides for dynastic reasons they got to maintain control of this Mississippi River. The English are interested in it. The Spanish are starting to get interested in it. People are getting knowledgeable about this river system. So what happens is Bienville and Iberville leave France, and their idea is to set up Port Pensacola. Because, you know, to this day, there's a great Navy base there. I mean, it's a perfect port. It's enclosed, protected from storms. The Spanish beat them. So when they get there, they can't continue further westward. So they work their way westward, and they stop at Ship Island and build an encampment. At which point, then, Bienville and Iberville decide to try to find where this river is. There's a lot of interesting stories involved up to that point. They do find the river, but they don't know what it is. So they enter the river. They go up. The first night they spend, believe it or not, on an island, and then they call it Mardi Gras Island because it's Mardi Gras Day, 1699. So then they come up the river, and they explore past Baton Rouge, they name it, because there's a cypress tree that's been stripped with all kind of symbols on it, and these animal skins, and it's kind of painted red. It could have been a red cypress to begin with. It's a demarcation line, I think, between, you probably correct me, the Houma and the Baibula Indians, I think it is. And they saw it just as a red stick, so they called it the red stick, Baton Rouge. You know, on the way down, they're still trying to find out whether they're in Mississippi, because they know that Tonti are referred to an East Fork. So the Indians tell Iberville, try Manchac, the back way. And so he names it Iberville Canal, which is now the Erie River. So he tells his brother, you go down to Mississippi the way we came up. I'm going to follow this and see where it goes. We'll be at Ship Island. So they split. And as they go to different directions, that's the first time you have Iberville coming through. He comes into a lake. He names Lake Waupun, who's the Minister of Marine. He then comes to another lake, which is bigger. He names it Lake Pontchartrain. You have to come to Pontchartrain. He then stops at a bayou where he takes a rest, and he realizes this is an interesting bayou. He names it Bayou St. John. He goes up a bit, sees there's an Indian trail, and he goes up to the Mississippi River. He's eaten alive by mosquitoes. It's hysterical. They've never experienced mosquitoes before. They're like, my God, these things are torment. So he heads back from there, goes through the Wrigley's, and gets to Ship Island. When he gets to Ship Island, his brother gets there soon after him, and he says, well, I don't know if it's the Mississippi River or not, but it's an interesting voyage. And that's supposedly when Bienville says it is, and he hands him a note from the Quinnipiac Indians signed by Tonti saying, this is the Mississippi River. So now you've got the fact that the French have now established that, but it's not until 18 years later, in 1718, when they established the city of New Orleans under the company of John Law. But that's basically how the Europeans come into the situation. So I'm not covering a whole lot of history in very few minutes. So that's just basically a thumbnail sketch of the development of the land. Some of the Native Americans there. I'm so thrilled we have people here. These are some artifacts from the local, right in this area here that we found.
They're all, some things that I found personally, some things that came out of a little collection. They're all from southeastern Louisiana and southern Mississippi. And they're all from the time period that you have been discussing.
Okay, so all right, so we don't have any specifically from St. Bernard, do we?
Yes, I do.
Yeah,
Oh,
we'll
you do
have a
have
chance to have that demonstration a little bit.
Oh, great, that'll be fantastic. I'm anxious to hear what you have to say too, because I'm sure you fill in a lot of blanks and answer a lot of questions for people. But anyway, so that's basically the process of the founding of the land, the first Native Americans there, in the Reader's Digest version, for those of you who don't know what Reader's Digest is. And also the early explorations of how people came here and settled, the Europeans settled the area. Thanks so much.
I grew up here in St. Bernard Parish, and I have a guest speaker tonight, someone I used to work with at NASA Stennis Space Center. His name is Dr. Marco Giordino, and he is an archaeologist and anthropologist. He has a degree in archaeology from Tulane University, and he's going to talk to us about the history of St. Bernard Parish from way before to...
Welcome to the club.
A little bit, anyway.
I went to a meeting yesterday and I saw Karen for the first time in 10 years, and she said, "Oh, you ought to come with me tomorrow. We go listen to a speech." Then she writes me today and she says, "You know, if you got 2 or 3 slides you want to put together, maybe you can find some time." Now I'm here to tell you everything that this gentleman just finished telling you. So what I did is, well, let me tell you something a little bit about my background so you understand the 6 slides that I have. I got a PhD from Tulane University. My specialty were Southeastern Indians, and most of my work was in St. Charles Parish, in Barataria, on Lake Cotahuachi, on Lake Salvador. And I used to know Mr. Treadaway. So in the 1970s, when I was a graduate student, I actually got to go out on a boat with him to shell piles out in St. Bernard and Fort Proctor and all the way around. Because of my study interests, I had to become very familiar, as you saw from the previous presentation, with the geology of Louisiana, because it is so incredibly dynamic. With the Mississippi River changing left and right and left and right, Indians would come once the place was a little more stable. They would stay until the saltwater encroachment or the stop of the flow of the fresh water, and then they would move to the next crevasse or the next tributary and so on. Well, there are 2 great things about Louisiana archaeology that most other places in the world don't have. One is that the archaeology that we find on these deltas actually helps the geologists date the deltas. Now granted, you do coring, you get carbon dates. Of course, these delta lobes are enormously deep, so it's not easy to drill into them. But once we understand the style and the types of artifacts that characterize a particular period of time, then when you go on these delta lobes and you find those artifacts, then you know from the archaeology the time of the occupation, and that helps the geologists put a time on the flowing and the coming of the delta. Now, you know, these time periods are hundreds of years. The slide I'll show you, the first, shows that there is so much discussion and so little agreement within a few hundred years of when these deltas start and end. But anyway, that's the first thing that's really very exciting about doing archaeology in Louisiana. The second thing is that the preservation of organic materials is incredible, because the Mississippi River, of course, is going to have many waterlogged locations and some locations where the mud is so anaerobic with so few bacteria that there's actually no decay. So over the course of Louisiana history, we've been able to find basketry and strings. There was a very famous site, the Bayou Jasmine site, which is a poverty point site up by Baton Rouge, where they actually found cordage, and cordage that was, I guess 2, 3, 4, 6,000 years old. They were able to figure out the plants that the cordage was made from, the type of braiding, and so on. The other great thing that is preserved, in addition to these very fragile things, are the bones. You mentioned the very well-preserved skull. We get a lot of human remains that are very well preserved. And also, very excitingly, animal bones, to the smallest vertebra of a fish. Now, I remember telling this story. I was born in Rome, and I went back a lot, and I would go talk to other archaeologists, and they would say, well, you know, today we dug up 2 statues from the temple, and what have you been doing? I said, oh man, you won't believe this. I got more fish bone from this site, and they look and they go, A great day for you is Fishbone. But, you know, when, in fact, American archaeology differs so much from European and Asian and African archaeology because they have a wealth of information written. They have temples, they have the Iron Age, the Bronze Age. The United States didn't have that. And so when you got north of the Mayans, who were an incredible civilization in their own right, the fact that we didn't have the kind of remains that were elsewhere forced us to concentrate on things like Fishbone. Well, that's truly anthropological archaeology, where instead of concentrating on art and style and form, you're really digging deep into the daily lives of the people that you just heard the presentation about. So you really start to learn a lot about their diets. You start to learn a lot about the technologies that were invented to go from hunting and gathering to agriculture. The amazing thing about this part of the world, Louisiana especially, is that there's very little evidence of agriculture, and that's not because they were not competent in growing corn. We do find some corn cobs here and there, but their diet doesn't change for over 2,500, in some cases 3,000 or 4,000 years. A lot of my recent work has been, I live in Bay St. Louis, so I work a lot the Mississippi Gulf Coast, which was impacted dramatically by the St. Bernard Delta because, and we see that in the faunal remains. So the earliest occupations of oysters, because at that time the lobe of the St. Bernard hadn't invaded Pontchartrain and hadn't gotten as far as Hancock County, Mississippi. So the Indians who were living there were hunting the same fish and the same deer and the same animals that we hunt today, but were collecting their shellfish in salt water, so they had oysters at the bottom of their middens, of their garbage piles. When the St. Bernard came, it caused the fresh water caused the region to become brackish. And so oysters were pushed out further in the Gulf, and we start to get all these Rangia clams, and which are a brackish water clam. So they continue to fish the same species. You can tell that they had boats because we have sharks, and we have redfish, and we have speckled trout, and we have crab, and we have shrimp. You know, the poor little Indians were not suffering, just like a Cajun does on Friday. You know, a good old Catholic, oh man, I'm stuck. I got to just only eat shrimp today, or crab, or gumbo, or so. Those things really don't stick out to people when you talk about an archaeological community until you really get down to the nuts and bolts of it, because in essence, the analysis that you do that is beyond the big mega structures is really way more indication of how the common people lived. And you know, history is biased always towards the victors. History is always biased towards the powerful, the kings, the generals, you know. It leaves it to the archaeologists to try to put some flesh and bones, if you will, on some of these people that lived here. So I can't really add much more to what you said, but let me finish with my last job at NASA was to do remote sensing, which included both satellite imagery and penetrating radars, in an effort to discover archaeological sites. When I was 24 in the 70s, I could go out in the marsh and I could walk the crevasses and I could dig. Now in my 50s and 60s, I stayed in my air-conditioned office, I pulled up the satellite images, and then I could just say to the crews, look, there's a site over there. Y'all go. All right, so what I wanted to show you in these few slides, the first one shows you the level of effort that goes into trying to date these deltas. The first man that came up with wow, I almost walked on stage. If you look at the Fraser in 1967, that was a cornerstone article in the dating of all the different delta lobes. And then Woody Gagliano, whom I thought was initially related to Greg, but was another archaeologist, geologist who worked extensively in St. Bernard and went to the LSU Coastal University program and had a very successful company, and he dated them somehow or other. And then there was a gentleman at Tulane that did some work on carbon dates. His dates were the youngest for the beginning of the St. Bernard. And Dr. Ottos and I did some studies that NASA sponsored and he conducted that seemed to show that around 4,000 years before the present, which would make it about 2000 BC roughly, we start to see evidence of the sediments of a large delta, in this case the St. Bernard Delta. So that's just to show you that there's a ongoing effort between geologists, archaeologists. There is bug people, the foram guys who dig up all the little bugs to tell you the changes in climate. They're really not bugs, they're more like marine life. So anyway, this is a critical element in archaeology in Louisiana and Mississippi, because we see an enormous impact from what's happening with the Mississippi River, even in South Mississippi. I can change these myself. Maybe this way? Oh, okay. So this is an example of what I was just trying to explain. When you get dates from either archaeology or geology, you can start to play one off against the other and become way more accurate about your estimation of when these people lived here. So here's one aspect of this, of the beginning of the St. Bernard Delta. Between 4,000 and 3,900 years ago, the western St. Bernard Delta begins to encroach through New Orleans. You saw how it cut off Lake Pontchartrain. And then, as you can see, it starts to migrate towards Hancock County. During that time, at a site named Blotto Bayou, which is in Mississippi, and that's what 22 stands for Mississippi. You know that, HA for Hancock County, the 504th site reported. During that time, we have carbon dates from the human occupation, which was a late archaic occupation, mostly Poverty Point. So now we can start to play back and forth between, okay, this is what the environment looked like, these are the kind of animals that you would have found here, here's the arrival of freshwater fish. Let's go to the site, dig it, and see if we can't find evidence for this massive ecological change that is occurring over hundreds of years. And so those two play off each other really, really well. I didn't put them all in there. One of the things that I thought was worth doing, and I wasn't the inventor of it, but because I was one of the only two archaeologists within all of NASA, we had a broad range of opportunities. What we did really well at Stennis was that we had a remote sensing and geographic information system program that was basically pioneering and state-of-the-art. A lot of the software you use today was pioneered at that center. And so we had the ability to take maps, and in this case a 1915 map, and overlay them over modern imagery. So again, I could tell people this is where you need to go because I've just overlaid a 1915 map over the picture we took yesterday, and you can actually walk your way or boat your way to where I want you to go. So this is a NOAA chart from early on, and one of the most important archaeological sites in St. Bernard is this Magnolia Mound. I don't know if you're all familiar with Magnolia Mound. It is very little explored because it's very difficult to get to. Here's Bayou La Loutre, and you know this one's mostly silted in, but in order to get to these areas, you have to really be an outdoorsman and a pioneer. And you can see how even in 1915, these maps already showed a very cut up type of landscape, but you can still see meandering streams. And really, the parts that are surviving are more likely than not the levees of the old distributaries of the St. Bernard. And one of the reasons they stay up that way is because they're built up higher. The other thing that's really interesting, and you probably know, we've been knowing it for a long time, is that live oak trees love to grow on elevated land. So it doesn't take a super duper NASA PhD rocket scientist genius to look for live oak trees on your satellite imagery. And now where that doesn't work in uplands, it works great in wetlands. So what we did is we went out and we flew an airplane over the area, and those are the two flight lines. We imaged where all the X's are. In fact, the X's all turned out to be archaeological sites of one kind or another. And we were really interested in these areas here because they're, again, quite difficult to get to survey. So here again is Bayou La Loutre. This was a major channel of the St. Bernard Delta. It extended all the way to Chandeleur Islands. St. Bernard built Chandeleur. And in fact, it was actually further out because the Chandeleurs have been being reworked towards shore. So this was probably the largest of all the 5 or 7 Mississippi deltas that you saw in the previous presentation. So we would go and get a satellite imagery. These images are in infrared, therefore all the vegetation is red for reasons that I'm not going to get into. And we had an identification from the very red spots, which indicate live oaks, that there were archaeological sites both on the maps and on our imagery. So we had an opportunity then to take some of these. Here, for instance, is Lake of the Mound. You know, doesn't take a genius to figure out. And in fact, there's an Indian mound. And so if you see the lake reconstructed, you can see in this area here, it's hard in this picture, but you can see the darker areas are those red oaks growing on top of this mound. And you can actually then overlay one on the other in a certain program. So if you get down to Magnolia, here's the mound on a 1915 map that I showed you before. Here, of course, is how much water has encroached on in just the time between these two images, so 2,085 years. And here you can see along the levees, the abandoned levees of La Loutre, all the dark purples and greens are all these hardwoods that tend to grow on high ground. And so that really is very helpful. In addition to which, remote sensing allows you to image at different times during a plant's life. So for example, April is a wonderful time to image live oaks because they're just starting to come out. You know, all that stuff that we sneeze out every day and cuss that falls, the yellow stuff on your car. Well, that's a stage in the life of a plant that is easily imaged because all the leaves are fresh and they're all coming out, and so they reflect light in a different way than a mature leaf does. So flying in April and flying these areas and looking for these kind of signatures is really a wonderful, efficient way to get archaeology done in our part of the world because well, I don't need to tell you. It's just hard to walk the marsh. It's just hard. You know, you've got pronostas, and you've got nutria holes, and you've got nutria itch, and you've got alligators, and you've got snakes, and you've got those pesky little mosquitoes, you know. And so, again, you can see the mound better just by looking for the coloration. And you wouldn't expect that kind of red there in the marsh because that just would not be high enough naturally to support that kind of settlement. If you get closer and closer to the mound, here you see the mound in the same shape as the 1915 map. You can still see the levees are high enough, even in the abandoned distributary, to cause it to grow trees. And then you have these, which are probably old meander belts. You know how if you look at a picture of Mississippi from the air today, you see all those oxbow lakes, you know, how the river migrates back and forth. Well, the fact that these are still above ground and still dry enough to support hardwoods means that the Bayou La Loutre at one point must have moved in this direction. And probably it was this big, because now if you go see Bayou La Fouche today, you know, you can spit across it. But when Bayou La Fouche was the main branch of the Mississippi River, it was the size of the Mississippi River. So you can imagine that some of these, like Bayou La Loutre and, Bayou Barataria, all these main channels that we still see around today were at one time or another the main flow of the river, which unleavened then would tend to silt itself up and then jump to the shortest distance to the Gulf until the Corps of Engineers solved the problem. Oh, whoops. Sarcasm. I had my sarcasm thumb. All right, so that basically is an overview.
My name is Greg Agliano. I grew up here in St. Bernard Parish, and ever since I was a little boy, my main interest has always been history, particularly archaeology. It's always been a great interest of mine. My father first got me interested in history, taking me out to old Fort Macomb, Fort Pike. He bought me my first metal detector, and that kind of got me hooked on history, collecting coins, antique bottles, and later on I started going out searching various locations where prehistoric Indian artifacts could be found. I want to talk about a few of the major archaeological sites in this immediate area. Dr. Giardini, he had mentioned a couple of them. There's a few places in our area. One of the sites would be out near what is now the present-day Lakefront Airport. It was known as the Littlewood site, and it's out near where Jazzland is at. And that was discovered probably back in the 1930s, and the WPA Works Project Administration, they did a lot of work out there. And when a site is given a certain name, like this was known as like the Littlewood site, and over in Fontainebleau State Park, there was a site, it's Chafunkta site. When a site like that is given a name, it means that there's been a lot of distinctive cultural and artifacts that have been found there that separates that from other areas. And there's a large majority of things that have been found there that gives it like a distinctive, its own distinctive traits to it. The Chafunkta people were the first people around Louisiana to develop ceramic pottery, maybe about 300, 400 BC. The very first pottery in Louisiana known would have probably been from Poverty Point. And those were made, those pottery bowls were made from steatite or soapstone. Later on, the Chafunkta people, which lived along slow meandering bayous near the lakes and rivers, they began developing pottery, which the distinctive trait with a lot of their pottery was very simple and plain bowls, but they did not use much any kind of tempering. And later cultures started using crushed clay pottery shards as tempering, sand, and later on the Plaquemine and Mississippian cultures were using crushed clam shells, the Reinkia cunidia shells, like as Dr. Giardini was talking about. And over the hundreds of years and even thousands of years, when certain people would live in areas, they built up massive amounts of these clamshell middens. They were basically trash refuse. They were also used for the disposal of bones of human remains. When people would die, certain cultures now would treat their dead, they would drag the bodies off to a certain area, let the body decompose, either by animals or just nature. They would gather up the bones and sometimes just bundle them together, toss them into the shell mound heaps. These mound heaps were used for like the disposal of trash, broken pottery, the remains of animals that they had eaten. But for certain cultures, they would often just deposit the remains of their dead there. Later cultures would get into more of a more elaborate burial procedure. When the bodies would be laid out, they would be buried with bowls that were specifically made for burial purposes. Some bowls, a lot of bowls that are utilitarian purposes that people used every day might be included, but often certain cultures would bury their dead with very fancy, elaborate made bowls, stone points, and all of that. And so around this area we have like different cultures. We have, the Chafunkta culture, and then later on the Marksville culture, going on into the Plaquemine, Mississippian cultures. But these all date from maybe about the years 3,500 years ago to about, the 1600s. So you have a wide variety of these cultures.